Tropes Media browse popular forums videos. Join login. Tropes Media browse popular indexes forums videos. Ask the Tropers. Trope Finder Media Finder Trope Launchpad Tech Wishlist Reviews Tools. Cut List Image Fixer New Edits New Articles Edit Reasons Launches Images List Crowner Activity Untyped Pages Recent Page Type Changes Changelog. Tips: Creating new redirects. Cross-wicking tips for editing. Text formatting rules. Glossary. Edit reasons. Handling spoilers. Wordcraft Administrivia. FAQ. Tropes HQ. About Us. Contact Us. DMCA Notice. Privacy Policy Report. Bug. Go ad-free. Changelog. Show spoilers. Night vision. Sticky header. Highlight links. Follow TV tropes. Edit page. Related. History. Ad review. Discussion more. To do. Page source. You need to log in to do this. Get known if you don't have an account. http://tvtropes.org/pmwiki/pmwiki.php/videogame/mouthwashing. Following. Video games. Mouthwashing. Go to. Edit page. Related. History. Ad review. Discussion. To do. Page source. Video game. Characters. Fridge. Nightmare fuel. Trivia. YMMV. Create subpage. Create new. Analysis archive. Awesome derivative work. Fanworks. Fanficari. CS. Funny haiku. Head scratchers. Heartwarming image links. Image source. Laconic media notes. Newsletter. Playing with quote. Source quotes. Recap referenced by shocking tearjerker. Timeline. WMG. The 5 crew members of the Tolpar are stranded in the empty reaches of space, shrouded in perpetual sunset. God is not watching. Pony Express long-haul space freighter Tolpar. Crew, 5. Planned shipment duration, 382 days. Elapsed transit time, 147 days. I hope this hurts. Mouthwashing is a psychological horror game developed by Swedish developer Wrong Organ, released on September 26, 2024. From the same people who made How Fish is Made and its standalone expansion The Last One and Then Another, which also serves as a teaser for this game before the demo's release. The long-haul space freighter Tolpar crashes into an asteroid somewhere during the middle of a long voyage where everyone's already a little on edge. Nobody thought the captain, Curly, had it in him to do such a thing. Of course, that's what the co-pilot Jimmy says. Now Jimmy, Anya, Daisuke, and Swansea are stuck with an almost entirely broken and forcefully sealed up ship, a mutilated and very alive Curly, and a lot of unanswered questions about the cargo that was so important to them to begin with. Mouthwashing provides examples of abuse discretion shot. Each time Jimmy feeds Curly his pain meds the screen cuts to black. The second time around the sounds of swallowing are followed up by heavy impacts and crying, indicating that Jimmy occasionally beats Curly to vent frustration over their situation. The alcoholic, Swansea used to be one, but is several years sober by the start of the game. The events of the story lead to him pretty quickly becoming one again, this time with 13% ethanol mouthwash. Ambiguous situation. It's never made clear why exactly Swansea was hiding the one functioning cryopod from the others. Jimmy assumes he just wanted to save himself in the event of everyone else dying, but Swansea dismisses this idea when confronted, and it's possible he was actually hoping to use it to save one of the others, most likely Daisuke, considering how torn up he is over the latter's injury and death and given the contents of his final monologue to Jimmy, where he laments not being able to give Daisuke a chance off this goddamned rock. Anachronic order. Mouthwashing tells its story in multiple chunks of time both way before and after the crash. Armor-piercing question. In Jimmy's final hallucination before the judgment, Paul asks him a question that lays open all the hypocrisy and futility of his actions through the game. If he's really so concerned about making amends and fixing his mistakes, then why is he so obsessed with Curly and not at all with Anya? Jimmy, Curly. Captain. I'm so sorry. Paul, You really mean that, huh? Jimmy, yes. Yes, yes, yes. I do. I fucked up. But I can still make this right. Our worst moments don't make us. Paul, wait a minute. Hold on. If all of that is true, why are you still so concerned with him? Arc words. I hope this hurts. Take responsibility. It's a constant reminder for Jimmy's inability to ever do it, constantly blaming others and passing the buck. The phrase "our worst moments don't make us monsters" recurs a few times, originally being something Curly would say to his friends. Anya and Jimmy both quote it as a remark on the crisis at hand, bringing out the crew's darker sides. Artistic license chemistry. Isopropyl alcohol isn't pure alcohol as claimed by the game, it's a different compound entirely. Note: if you want to be pedantic, isopropyl alcohol is technically a type of alcohol. However, it's not ethanol, the one everyone means when they say alcohol. Drinking a whole bottle of it would almost certainly kill you, not make you drunk. Artistic license medicine. Mouthwash is toxic to ingest, and drinking several bottles of it a day for months should be fatal. In real life, people do actually die from drinking mouthwash, usually desperate alcoholics who can't find anything safer to use. Auto-cannibalism. As food supplies dwindle, alongside Jimmy and Curly being the last people left behind. The former, who's already going down with a really bad case of sanity slippage, puts the latter on the table and proceeds to cut up one of his legs for sustenance. If that wasn't bad enough, Jimmy then forces Curly to start eating his own flesh as well, force-feeding it to his former captain again even if Curly vomits the piece out. Acts crazy, with Jimmy and Swansea being the last two crewmates standing, barring Curly. The two finally reach their breaking points and are outright trying to kill each other in the climax. Almost literally in Swansea's case, as he's the one carrying the emergency fire axe as a weapon. However, despite Swansea being the one to escalate into violence first, he does give Jimmy a bit of respite before finally trying to kill him. Taking everything into account, and Jimmy being the cause of not only the crash but the deaths of all the other crewmates, it's definitely Jimmy who's more deranged of the two. Bad boss. Jimmy as acting captain is a terrible reign, to say the least. He constantly blames the others, harms and harasses his crewmates, and constantly commits selfish and reprehensible acts for the sake of advancing his needs, directly leading to the deaths of 3 of the crewmates, Curly's mutilation, and constant suffering for months. All while never taking responsibility and pinning the blame on everyone and everything but himself. The Pony Express executives above Jimmy and Curly might be somehow even worse, enforcing some comedically abusive working conditions, skimping on the ship's food supply only to suddenly add a 5th mouth to feed at short notice, and deducting any accidental expenses from the crew's paychecks. Bandage Mummy, a completely horrifying example for Curly. Due to being at the cockpit as the ship goes for a head-on collision towards an asteroid, he practically takes the brunt of the damage and is left absolutely mutilated by the end of it. All his skin burned off, losing an eye and having no hands nor feet. Bang, 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 the revolver Jimmy uses to kill Swansea has so much kick to it that it causes brief tinnitus every time he shoots with it. Big Bad. Jimmy is the crew member ultimately responsible for causing the crash, and is also directly responsible for most of the other crew members' hardships, from impregnating Anya, implicitly non-consensually, to manipulating Daisuke into entering a dangerous vent where he gets injured, to torturing and cannibalizing Curly. Bromantic foil. Jimmy and Curly are one of the darkest possible examples of this trope, specifically when it comes to their leadership. Curly by all accounts is a perfectly competent captain who puts his crewmates first. He recognizes immediately something about Anya is off, and he quietly comforts her and asks if she needs any help, helps Daisuke when he gets in trouble, and smooths over most of the tension Daisuke and Swansea have. Jimmy, meanwhile, is constantly selfish, irresponsible, and entitled, believing he's meant for better things while crumbling easily under pressure, constantly blaming others, and crashing the ship in a bungled murder-suicide plot to avoid having to deal with the reality of his being laid off after the job is complete. But thou must, at certain points of the game, the intertitles will begin to push Jimmy in the direction he's supposed to go. Capitalism is bad. The Pony Express Company is never portrayed as anything but monstrous in their overbearing business practices and casual disregard for the well-being of their workers. The cost of living is high enough that Anya doesn't have any savings. None of the crew have any kind of job security except maybe Curly, and the prospect of losing their jobs at the end of the trip drives several crew members to emotional breakdown. At one point, a TV shows a Cold War-era pro-capitalism propaganda cartoon, juxtaposed with the bleak surroundings of the freighter cargo bay. Oh, and the corporate mascot of the Pony Express Company is used in jump scares so many times that it practically qualifies the game as a mascot horror. Cerebus callback, when the crew discovers their cargo being practically a whole system's worth of mouthwash. Anya ponders about using them as a disinfectant but also realizes that the sugar content offsets that possibility. The penultimate parts of the finale has Jimmy use it to treat the wounds of a mortally injured Daisuke. True to what Anya said, it does nothing but prolong Daisuke's agony, driving Swansea to give him a mercy kill. Dark secret, Jimmy either coerced or actively sexually assaulted Anya, and she's pregnant by the time the ship crashes. Deadly euphemism, the captain's cockpit contains an access code for an emergency kit, which eventually turns out to actually be a revolver, for use in case of mutiny. Deuteragonist, Curly is the protagonist for the before the crash segments except for the very first one, and Jimmy is the protagonist for the after segments. Downer ending, Swansea, Anya, and Daisuke all end up dead. Curly is left horrifically mangled, traumatized, and mutilated by Jimmy, who puts him into a cryopod. Jimmy escapes any possibility of accountability for his actions by committing suicide. With all the care the Pony Express has shown, it's likely Curly will die 20 years later, after the power supply finally fails and no one ever comes looking for him. At least he'll die somewhat peacefully in his sleep this time. Driven to suicide, two characters, Anya and Jimmy, choose to die by suicide thanks to the stress of the stranding and the lack of hope for rescue and a future after that, and the inability to face responsibility for any of his actions that doomed them all to begin with, respectively. Anya dies via overdosing on painkillers, Jimmy takes the emergency revolver and shoots himself. XP, Anya bears a striking resemblance to Shelley Duvall's Wendy from The Shining. Daisuke also closely resembles Ryusuke from the Japanese horror film Kero. Fate worse than death, somehow, Curly being effectively burnt to a crisp, bedridden, and incapable of speaking after the ship crashes is just the start of the bad time he gets handed. He's left in that horrific state for months, constantly force-fed painkillers, from opiates to paracetamol when it runs out. Jimmy is constantly verbally abusing and even physically injuring him through the force-feeding, and ultimately, Jimmy further mutilates him, feeds Curly pieces of his own body in self-righteous delusion, and he's put into one of the cryopods in that horrific state while Jimmy dies by suicide. Flower motifs. More than once in the final stretch of the game Jimmy hallucinates a glowing pink hibiscus bloom in association with a reminder of Daisuke being dead. Force-feeding. One very memorable segment in the game involves Jimmy force-feeding Curly his own cut-up flesh in a twisted attempt to give his former captain sustenance in order to keep him alive. Said segment has Jimmy in a state of insanity, starts imagining the captain strapped to some kind of operating table device that has monitors showing the meat going from his mouth to his esophagus and intestines. Curly also has several valves stuck to his body and Jimmy must turn the valves, which also turns the organs inside of the monitors, to the correct order for him to swallow it. Get it wrong and Curly vomits out the piece of meat, which doesn't deter Jimmy in the slightest as he will be able to force-feed that same vomited out piece of human flesh back to Curly. From bad to worse, Mouthwashing's plot starts pretty mundane, and then just completely devolves into utter chaos after a little bit of bad news begins to compound into worse and worse news by the minute. First, Daisuke is added last minute as an intern for Swansea, who can't stand how completely incompetent he is, and his inclusion means they're going to have to stretch their ultimately meager food for the trip. Then the crew learns that the company is going under the minute they finish their last job, with Curly only really having any prospects in landing on his feet. They have to tow a highly suspicious, massive shipment of something that they're not allowed to get into, then it's revealed that the company-provided psyche evals were not accurate in the slightest, forcing Curly to have to put up with a number of neuroses that the crew are suddenly exhibiting, Swansea's being uncooperative, Anya's freaking out about something, Jimmy's being unusually mean, and Daisuke's just an intern with zero experience. All of that is before they crash, after which point it all goes entirely to hell. Good all along, the introductory sequence sets up Curly as the main villain of the game, with the fallout of his intentional crashing of the ship practically dooming everyone aboard. His gnarly appearance after the crash makes him look particularly sinister as well. Then, 2/3 into the game, it is revealed that Jimmy was actually responsible for everything going wrong and Curly is entirely innocent, having been nothing but a genuinely good captain. Greater scope villain, while the big bad of the actual events on the ship is Jimmy, the entire crew are only in this awful situation at all because of the terrible business practices of the Pony Express Company. Green-eyed monster, Jimmy towards Curly. It's made clear that Jimmy resented Curly for being a great captain that everyone always seemed to praise, while he's just a co-pilot. When Curly confided in him that he wants to look for a new job that would make him feel more fulfilled, Jimmy took it as him thinking he's something better than him, especially when Curly had to break the news that they were all out of a job because the company is closing down. So after Jimmy crashed the ship and Curly was out of commission, he basically appointed himself as the new captain and desperately tried to prove he was better at it, only for practically everything he does to end up making things even worse. In the end, despite still trying to downplay his own culpability, Jimmy has no other choice but to admit that Curly was the better man. Incompetence, Inc., little wonder that the Pony Express went under by the time of the prologue. They have absolutely no respect for OSHA compliance, leading to horrifically unsafe workplaces and poor morale, skip proper screening and psychological evaluations leading to pressure cooker-like environments in long-haul deliveries, and nickel and dime their employees so hard, yet clearly can't keep their own finances in order to at least stop bankruptcy. Depressingly, it's subtly implied that Pony Express going under in the first place has little to do with any of their incompetence or abusive policies. They're just one of the last companies to use human crewmates as opposed to full automation. That in itself likely explains all the safety hazards and extreme cost cutting, since they'd be the only way a company that uses ships with manned crews that require food, water, and salaries could have any hope of keeping up with companies that are fully automated and thus need none of those. I'm a humanitarian. Towards the very end of the game, after everyone else is already dead, Jimmy takes Curly to the dining table where he has arranged the corpses of the others for another party. He cuts up Curly's leg and distributes it to everyone's plates, as well as force-feeds it to Curly himself. In the final chapter, when Jimmy carries Curly to the cryopod, looking back at Jimmy's seat shows that his plate is the only one that's empty, meaning he did indeed eat the piece of leg. Implied rape, Anya is revealed to be pregnant, with Jimmy as the father. While it's never explicitly stated how consensual their encounter was, there are flashbacks with Curly where we see her lament both the absence of locks on the bedroom doors and the fact that she isn't allowed to access the ship's only gun to defend herself with. She's also obviously uncomfortable around Jimmy both before and after the crash, saying she hates doing his psych evals and being the only crew member who doesn't have a mattress in the same area he sleeps in. Jimmy, for his part, seems worried about facing nasty consequences when the ship arrives at its destination and the pregnancy is discovered, which is part of what leads to him crashing the ship. Informed attribute, Jimmy repeatedly complains to Curly about how all I ever hear about is how great of a captain you are. While Curly attests to having a decent talent and track record as a freighter pilot and at least tries to be involved and supportive of the rest of the crew's emotional problems, he never truly demonstrates spectacular leadership qualities and not much praise actually comes out of the mouths of Anya, Swansea, or even Daisuke. This may have been deliberate and a subtle indicator that Jimmy's envy and paranoia stretches back much farther than the week before the crash. Interface screw. During a segment with Jimmy searching through the sickbay to find disinfectant for a mortally injured Daisuke, a static-like visual glitch prevents the player from seeing anything in the area where Curly lies, leaving it very ambiguous if Anya actually gave him a mercy kill or not. A later segment set after this reveals what is behind it: Anya's corpse, her having taken her own life via an overdose. Internal reveal: the crew decide to open the cargo they've been carrying in the desperate hope that it might contain supplies of food or medicine. Having read the title of the game, the player probably knows that it's nothing but mouthwash. Jaded washout, Swansea is an old recovering alcoholic who has dedicated much of his life to the Pony Express. That work combined with an implied unhappy personal life has worn him down to a deeply bitter, cynical man. In his final moments prior to Jimmy killing him, he admits that his attempts at being normal, getting sober, finding a stable job and starting a family, had left him miserable and unfulfilled, and that the happiest time of his life were his years as an alcoholic. Jerkus has a point: as cruel, callous, and suspicious as the Pony Express delivering the bankruptcy and firing notices to only Curly, the captain, in the before section, the events of the game ultimately prove that the crew they threw together couldn't have handled it. Having staffed the ship with people of questionable morale, competence, and psychological wellness, and since they'd be stuck there for months with no one to rely on but each other, telling them prematurely that they'll be out of jobs in a few months once they land in an entirely different system is going to be a bad idea. Maybe things would have went to hell anyway, but Jimmy's reaction to Cully's being the better man is a key tipping point. Jerk with a heart of gold, Swansea is cranky, uncooperative, and soon stuck in a despair-fueled drunken haze. He still takes safety very seriously and cares about his useless apprentice Daisuke far more than he lets on. It's very likely he was saving the last cryopod to give Daisuke a second chance, and having to mercy kill him after Jimmy gets him mortally wounded is what finally sends him off the deep end. Madness mantra: Jimmy's continual insistence that he's going to fix everything. At first it seems overly optimistic at worst, but he continues to cling to the phrase far beyond the point of reason, even just before shooting Swansea. They're his last words before he puts Curly in cold sleep and kills himself. Mercy kill: after Daisuke is grievously injured crossing the broken and dangerous vent, with his condition worsened when Jimmy uses mouthwash to try and disinfect his wounds. Swansea can no longer bear to see Daisuke suffer and decides to put him down by bringing the emergency fire axe to his face. MacGuffin: the thing that the crew has been risking their life for all this time? The important, no questions asked completely final job the Tulpar needs to deliver? An entire system's supply worth of the company's mouthwash. Not only does this discovery hammer home the complete hopelessness of the crew's situation, its ethanol content allows them to get completely wasted. This does not help their deteriorating mental states. Mummies at the dinner table: after the entire crew except for himself and Curly are killed off, Jimmy sets up a mockery of the birthday party they threw for Curly earlier in the game in the lounge with everyone's corpses in the chairs and Curly laid out on the table. He then hallucinates the dead crew members cheering and toasting him like they are all alive and happy for him before egging him on into carving up Curly for a meal. Murder-suicide: the game starts with the Tulpar's captain intentionally crashing the ship into an asteroid and disabling the autopilot to prevent it from correcting their course, implicitly to kill every single person aboard. Except it was Jimmy that did it, not Curly. All because he couldn't bear having to face the consequences of his actions. Never my fault: Jimmy's main character flaw is his inability to ever take responsibility for his actions. All throughout the game, he always blames someone else for his predicament, or claims to want the responsibility and perks of being in a position of authority while constantly proving he can't be trusted with that power. He can't even bring himself to accept that he tried to crash the ship and take everyone out with him in murder-suicide, rather than face the reality of being laid off once the ship landed and completed its delivery, still a failure who can't make anything of himself because he can't own up for his screw-ups. Nice job breaking it, hero. Jimmy's attempt to rescue Anya and Curly from the medbay is a chain reaction of poor and rash decisions, most of which wind up being pointless as Anya has already taken her own life by the time they manage to get inside. First he makes a plan to spike Swansea to knock him out for access to the utility room using the ship's only bottle of isopropyl disinfectant, then goads Daisuke into crawling into a dangerous ventilation shaft that results in him getting critically injured. Since he'd already used up all the actual disinfectant they had, Jimmy resorts to using mouthwash to sterilize Daisuke's wounds, which only makes his condition even worse to the point Swansea has to give him a mercy kill. In the final act, Jimmy still thinks he can fix the situation after the entire crew dies by placing Curly in the last working cryopod and then committing suicide himself. All this does is ensure Curly's suffering is prolonged and he'll likely die alone in 20 years' time when the power runs out and nobody comes to save him, and if he is saved, it will take years of grueling rehabilitation and surgeries to do a full-body skin graft. Hopefully, he'll be able to afford prostheses. No good deed goes unpunished, though the crew was already falling apart and bound to explode at some point during the journey. The real kicker is Curly deciding to be a good man and sharing the company's secret message to him, the captain, about how the company was going under and everyone was losing their jobs after the delivery was done. The intention was they could all psychologically prepare themselves, then have it rushed onto them as soon as they landed. However, Jimmy's realization that his future was over and Curly was the only one even getting out remotely unscathed from this, alongside Anya being pregnant and both having no financial means or future, drives Jimmy to fly the ship into the asteroid that will indirectly kill them after they're stranded. No OSHA compliance. The organization clearly does not exist in this universe, as the Pony Express would have been shut down much earlier for countless violations if it did. All crew members are obligated to only get a maximum of 5 hours of sleep each night, where pilots in the real world are given 10 and need at least 8. Medical expenses for workplace accidents come out of their pay, rather than being insured or at the liability of the company. The sleeping areas have no locks, despite every other location having locks, which is part of the reason Anya is implied to have been sexually assaulted and impregnated by Jimmy. There are 4 cryopods for emergency sheltering in place, yet the Tulpar has 5 crewmates with the intern Daisuke assumed to be a last-minute addition. The psych evaluations are intentionally poorly overseen, resulting in 4 very unstable/incompetent people being trapped together in a confined space for over a year. The emergency ceiling foam traps the crew out of their original sleeping quarters and most of the ship, with no redundancies or countermeasures in place for reaching vital areas like food storage. No party like a Donner Party, after running out of food. Part of the reason the crew keep Curly alive in that horrific state is to make sure his body stays fresh for them to cannibalize and survive on. This never comes to pass, and it's unclear if anyone besides Jimmy had even seriously considered it. Psychological projection. Jimmy has a habit of projecting onto Curly. When Curly breaks the news on Pony Express folding, Jimmy creatively reinterprets the talk they had a day prior, where Curly confessed he felt unsatisfied in his position, into Curly claiming he was too good for the crew and wished he could ditch them while still being the hero. In the final act of the game, a hallucination of Curly says that he is taking responsibility for the crash, that Jimmy should finish what he started, and that he'll keep playing the villain. Also that Jimmy can be the better man in the end. Before Jimmy crashes the ship in a botched murder/suicide, he frames it as if it's something he's doing for Curly. Red herring. A few segments involving Curly really make it seem like he might have actually crashed the ship during some kind of mental breakdown. With even the opening of the game having us presumably play as Curly while he's doing it. It's actually Jimmy being playable in the prologue and he's the main cause of the Tulpar's crash. Swansea carrying an axe for most of the game, his clearly worsening condition, both physical and mental, and his angry cantankerous attitude leads us to believe that he might go full on the Shining on the crew and try to kill them one by one. While he does finally descend into violence by mercy killing Daisuke and trying to murder Jimmy with that axe, ultimately the one who actually causes most of the deaths is Jimmy, with him being the rightful source of Swansea's murderous ire in the hours leading up to judgment. Revenge by proxy. During Jimmy and Curly's final mutual conversation just before the ship crashes, the former heavily implies that he chose to sexually assault Anya because if it was ever reported it would result in a black mark for the latter over his failure to prevent such an incident on his watch as captain. Rewatch bonus. Due to the game's anachronic order, a lot of things in the story make a lot more sense once the full picture is painted. The game's opening shows how the ship crashed with the player taking control of who is presumably Curly. Except you start at the left seat, which is the same seat that Jimmy sat on while Curly gave him a psych evaluation. The prologue also has the playable character looking for the code scanner. Meanwhile, each segment before the crash involving Curly shows that he already has it in his inventory. Interacting with the autopilot override key with Curly will have him comment that he should keep an eye on it just in case, apparently setting up his later intention to use it to crash the ship. Except he's actually wanting to keep it away from the openly depressed and suicidal Jimmy. Anya being incredibly nauseous while dealing with Curly could be attributed to her either not being prepared to handle Curly's level of mutilation or being underqualified as a nurse. It could also be because she's pregnant and becoming easily nauseous is one of the symptoms for it. Anya goes for longer without drinking the alcoholic mouthwash than the rest of the crew, and admits at one point that she's tempted but it probably wouldn't fix anything. She's pregnant, and is seemingly considering whether or not to attempt to induce miscarriage via alcohol consumption. In one of Curly's flashback scenes, Anya asks him how much longer they have left until the ship arrives at their destination, and seems pretty grim about the answer being a little under 8 months. In hindsight, this scene is probably not long after she realized she was pregnant, and she's figuring out how likely it is that she'll give birth before they arrive. If you consider Jimmy to have raped Anya, there are various bits that make sense in that context. Anya repeatedly recoils at the mere presence of Jimmy and avoids looking him in the eye. Jimmy's idea to knock out Swansea with a drugged drink and his knowledge of how to prepare it could be because he has previous experience using date rape drugs. Anya makes a seemingly offhand comment wondering about how there are no locks on the doors to sleeping quarters, which takes a much more darker tone under this interpretation. Rule of symbolism, Anya glumly notes that the ocean of mouthwash that the crew is shipping is worthless as a disinfectant thanks to its sugar content, and in fact sugary substances will worsen infections due to feeding bacteria. Likewise, Jimmy's attempts to wash away his crimes are all some combination of insufficient, irresponsible, and violently insane, and make the already dire situation on the ship into a living hell. This also applies to Curly, who has all the ingredients to be a good captain, but ultimately failed because he was too sweet to Jimmy, feeding his horrid behavior instead of killing it. In reality, most modern mouthwashes no longer use sugar. Instead, they use sweeteners that bacteria can't metabolize. Sanity slippage. After the crash, Jimmy experiences horrific hallucinations that only get worse and more frequent as the game progresses. The prologue shows that this isn't a new development, though it's unclear if he suffered from it before he set the ship's fatal course. Space isolation horror. Crashing into an asteroid out somewhere where they're unlikely to ever be rescued even if they had enough functioning cryopods to put everyone on ice makes what was already an unpleasant pressure cooker of a situation far, far worse. Sunk cost fallacy. This turns out to be the driving cause for much of the plot. Jimmy's increasingly diluted fixation on not being defined by his worst moment, likely the rape and impregnation of Anya, leads him to take desperate measures to either redeem or move the blame off himself, committing more atrocities which he then also attempts to fix. This dooms the crew and ensures their last days are utterly nightmarish. Surfer Dude, Daisuke is a happy-go-lucky slacker who has long hair, wears Hawaiian shirts, and once described his job to Anya as totally awesome, like so awesome. Sweet Tooth, Daisuke suggests adding an extra packet of the strictly rationed sweetener to the one company-permitted cake they are allowed to make. Later on, it turns out he's been stealing those packets and hiding them in his bed for future use. Unreliable narrator. For most of the game, you're given the impression that Curly somehow snapped and crashed the ship into an asteroid, and now the crew has to figure out what to do while he's out of commission and they're running out of food. Eventually it's shown that Jimmy was the one who crashed the ship after he was found out by the rest of the crew. Villain protagonist. Jimmy is not a good person. Rude, manipulative, demeaning, possibly a rapist, and to top it all off he's the one who crashed the ship. It says a lot that the achievement where he's killed 10 times in a row is called the good ending. Womb horror. When particularly stressed, Jimmy has hallucinations about fleshy, womb-like growths and being chased by monstrous versions of the Pony Express mascot that cry like newborn babies. It eventually becomes clear that this is the result of him mixing together the stress caused by the abusive company that employs him and his guilt over impregnating Anya. Previous Index. Next. Mother, Erwin Segarane. Psychological horror. Needy streamer overload. Mothered. Horror video games. Mr. Hop's Playhouse. Mouse, PI for hire. Indie game. Move or Die. Minecraft. Swedish media. Moving Out. Mothered. Sci-fi horror. Not Dying Today. Moonlight Pulse. Video games of 2023-2026. Mr. Hop's Playhouse 1. Show spoilers. Night Vision. Sticky header. Wide load. Important links. Ask the Tropers. Trope Finder, Media Finder, Trope Launchpad, Tech Wishlist, Reviews, Go ad free. Crucial browsing. Indexes. Genre. Action adventure. Comedy. Commercials. Crime and punishment. Drama. Horror. Love. News. Professional wrestling. Speculative fiction. Sports story. War. Media. All media. Animation, Western. Anime. Comic book. Fan FICS. Film. Game. Literature. Music and sound effects. New media. Print media. Radio. Sequential art. Tabletop games. Television. Theater. Video game. Webcomics. Narrative. Universal. Applied Phlebotinum. Characterization. Characters. Characters as device. Dialogue. Motifs. Narrative devices. Paratext. Plots. Settings. Spectacle. Other categories. British Telly. The contributors. Creator speak. Creators. Derivative works. Language. Laws and formulas. Show business. Split personality. Stockroom. Trope. Tropes. Truth and lies. Truth in television. Topical tropes. Betrayal. Censorship. Combat. Death. Family. Fate and prophecy. Food. Holiday. Memory. Money. Morality. Politics. Religion. School. Resources. Tools. Wiki tools. Cut list. Image fixer. New edits. New articles. Edit reasons. Isolated pages. Launches. Images list. Recent videos. Crowner activity. Untyped pages. Recent page type changes. Templates. Trope entry. Works. Character sheet. Playing with. Fandom. Tips. Creating new reader recs. Cross-wicking. Tips for editing. Text formatting rules. Glossary. Edit reasons. Handling spoilers. Wordcraft. Administrivia. FAQ. Changelog. Report bug. Trope repair shop. Image pickin. Advertisement. Advertisement. Top. Edit page. Related. History. Ad review. Discussion more. To do. Page source. TV tropes. About TV tropes. TV tropes goals. Troping code. TV tropes customs. Tropes of legend. Go ad free. Community. Ask the Tropers. Trope Launchpad, Trope Finder, Media Finder, Tech Wish List, Reviews, Forum, Tropes HQ, About Us, Contact Us, Report Bug, Changelog, DMCA Notice, Privacy Policy, Switch to Desktop Mobile Version. TV Tropes is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike 3.0 Unported license. Permissions beyond the scope of this license may be available from Thesta FF at tvtropes.org.